We'd like to thank Mainspring Companies for sponsoring Season 1 of The Next Entrepreneur. Mainspring celebrates the entrepreneurial journey, and we are very grateful for their support.
The key is to keep your head up and keep your eyes open and surround yourself with people smarter than you. That's where the opportunities come from. You're not going to get the opportunities from hanging out with your friends at McDonald's. It ain't going to happen. So find ways to network with people, talk to people, ask them what they're into, what's their interest, and you share your interest. They tell somebody else about your interest. You've got an idea. You've got to be fishing where the fish are.
Welcome, everyone, to The Next Entrepreneur. My name is Andrew McClendon, your host, and we are here today with former CEO and chairman of the board of Safera, a luxury linen company, Mr. Paul Hooker. Paul, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
And thank you for welcoming us into your beautiful home. It's just amazing. And so we are upstairs in the playroom and looking forward to our chat.
Yes, well.
I did want to start with how we met years ago.
That was a true serendipitous trip. So my wife and I are devoted watchers of NBC Nightly News. We saw a clip toward the end of what you do, and that was it for me. I started tracking you down, Googled you down, I found you, and I said, we want to be a part of what you're doing, Andrew.
And that was a segment called Making a Difference.
That's right.
And they had come to Baton Rouge, where our offices are, and did a segment on our family foundation, our charitable project, the McClendon Family Foundation. And so you reached out to us after seeing that, and it was only a few weeks later, my wife and I came to visit you and your executive director, Luke Sims, up in New York City, and we had a wonderful meal together, and that started a great project where we're working together. And we're going to talk about that a little later because we had a wonderful morning with that project. But let's get on to the story of your business career. I think there's a lot to learn there. And so Safera was your business.
Yes.
Right? And can you give us a brief overview of the history of Safera?
Sure. So the Sferas was an Italian family, and the turn of the century, 1891, they developed a small little embroidery business in Venice, right off San Marco Square. And that generation then came over on the boat, and the sons of the original Sfera decided to continue the business in America. So now we're in the early 1900s. And the two sons continued the business, basically importing hand embroideries from Italy that the nuns made in the convents, and artifacts and laces. And they sold them to the high net worth individuals of the day, the Rockefellers or DuPonts, up and down the East Coast. They would literally go from Maine to Florida, and they travel with their steamer trunk. And so as the company progressed, one of the Sferas died, and Albert Sfera continued it. So I'm bringing you up now to 1977. So Albert Sfera had a part-time bookkeeper and his wife, the three of them, in a little cubby on 31st and 5th in New York City. And they had been there since the building was new in 1901. This is now 1977. And Albert had one son, and he decided he didn't want to go into the business. So Albert waited till then, and when he had nobody to take over, and Albert was in his early 70s then, he contacted my brother-in-law, George Matuk, and George is in the linen business. So George and I talked, and I was in Jacksonville, Florida, just out of college with my wife, working for Armstrong Floors. And George said, how would you like to move to New York? It was complete culture shock. So Margot and I moved to New York. I mean, I'm from Orville, Ohio, a a big outing for us would maybe be to go to Cleveland. I mean, I had never been outside the environments. So to go to New York was culture shock, but I was 25 years old. Let's give this thing a try.
Okay, so you graduate from Bowling Green State University in 75.
Correct.
You get into the textile business.
Correct. Well, from 75 to 77, I was in the acoustical ceiling Armstrong floor business. Yeah, I was a marketing rep for Armstrong.
Okay. And then because of the connection with that, was that your brother-in-law?
It was my wife's, Margaret's brother-in-law, yeah.
You were bought into that opportunity, or that's when the Safera opportunity started for you in 1977.
Now, I will say this is one of my tenets of life when I speak to people looking for their first job, college graduates, looking for that perfect job. They're going to hold out and wait. My advice to them is grab the job and then network from that job. Nobody works 40 years at a factory anymore. They just don't. So when you get out of college or get out of your trade school, don't be too particular. I jumped into Armstrong in 2 years of working with architects, working with contractors, developing people skills at 21, 22 years old. That really gave me the jump and the confidence to be able to do this.
Yeah. I graduated from college in the mid-'80s in the midst of a big recession and in the construction field. And the economy was particularly rough in the oil patch down in Louisiana. And but I did have a job as a laborer. And we had a big concrete pour on the day of my graduation. But I knew that if I didn't make that concrete pour, that I would be replaced. And I passed my college graduation to work at $7 an hour and pouring concrete and just took it from there. But I think I subscribe to that same philosophy that you're talking about there.
Well, too, just as a background, I'm a kid from Warville, Ohio. My mom died when I was 7, and my dad worked in the railroad, and he had 5 of us to raise from 3 to 17, and he raised us himself. So we didn't come from anything, and to be able to go to college, I'm first-generation college, I helped pay for it. My dad as well. We struggled to make sure we got through it. So that's the story of the entrepreneur. You figure out how to get things done.
Right. So speaking of that, how does a 25-year-old guy get into business?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors involved. Luck is certainly involved. Serendipitous things happen. The key is to keep your head up and keep your eyes open and surround yourself with people smarter than you. That's where the opportunities come from. You're not going to get the opportunities from hanging out with your friends at McDonald's. It ain't going to happen. So find ways to network with people, talk to people, ask them what they're into, what's their interest. Then you share your interest. They tell somebody else about your interest. You've got an idea. You've got to be fishing where the fish are. You've got to be in that group. That's the first and biggest thing I'd recommend, because from then on it's serendipitous. But if you're not engaged and networked with people smarter than you and in better positions than you to learn from them, it's very tough to try to make it on your own. So,
but your particular start with Safera and any capital that may have involved, is that a family and friends thing at that point as far as your investment in the company?
Well, what happened was Safera at that time when we bought the business, was doing annual sales of $250,000. So we bought the business for like $30,000, and I didn't have a dime. So my brother-in-law loaned me the money, and we did a 1/3, 2/3. So I had no money. I was going to put sweat equity into the businesses, which is what I did. And then I grew it, and worked hard, paid him back, eventually bought more of the business. And that's really how it happened. So I didn't have any capital at all to start that business.
Yeah, as is the case for many entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1977, what did the Safera product lines look like?
So 1977, Sfera we were bringing in very few things. We're bringing in napkins from Ireland, laces from France, very small, distinct items because we were small. We didn't have a broad base. And we were selling them to the retail stores, little shops all over America. But again, it was small, and our product line was small. And I didn't know anything about this. I didn't grow up with fine linens. So I figured I've got to get out or I'm going to die. So I got on a plane and just started traveling all over the world to people who were smarter than me, who knew more than I did. And I learned from them. And then we got into bedding and we got into all different things as I learned more. I was not... It's the same analogy I just said about how do you get started. You don't get started sitting around with your friends or sitting in your room. You got to get out, surround yourself, immerse yourself in life.
So I was going to ask you what that culture shock was like in your first year of ownership, and realizing that you had to get out. How quick a connection was that for you?
It was pretty quick. I remember Albert Sfera sitting next to me at the desk, and I was sitting at a desk, and we had a stapler in between us. And one day I moved that stapler about 6 inches toward him to give me some more room. And Albert picked that stapler up. He slammed it back down. He said, "Paul, that stapler's been there since 1954, and it'll be there tomorrow." I went home and cried. I said, "Margot, what are we doing? What am I doing?" So the contract with Albert was he would agree to stay for 1 year. And every night I'd go home and mark the X on the calendar. Couldn't wait. I loved Albert, but I was 25 years old and he was 75, and moving the stapler wasn't in my realm of importance.
So I did have a specific question for you. Was there a point where you said, "Oh man, what have I gotten myself into"?
Oh, every day. I mean, Albert had the office, a small office we had the paint was literally curling off the walls in big curls. And I sat down with him one day and I said, "Albert, do you think we could paint this place?" It was a small shoebox. And Albert leaned over and he got in my face. He said, "Paul, let me tell you something about painting. You can paint this place, but you got to be ready to do it every 25 or 30 years." And I went home again and cried. So it was these stories every single day. The last one of the many was in the office. We had these big Mosler safes, and the Mosler safes have the big handles, and you open them up, and that's usually where jewelry and stuff is. So we would put our linens in there, and then when the buyers came in, I'd pull them out of the safe and show them. So when we grew a little bit more, it was time to move. And George, my partner, and I said, "We're going to make a killing on these safes. We're going to advertise it. These are relics." So long story short, we not only had no responses to our ad in the New York Times, so we told the landlord, "You know what, we're out of here, but you can buy these safes." He said, "Buy them." He said, "You got to get these things out of here. Don't you realize that every of these small offices that were built in the early 1900s have Mosler safes?" We had to hire a construction company to come in with jackhammers because the doors were so heavy you couldn't even get more than that down the elevator. So these were just life lessons. It was amazing.
So at what point along the way did you start developing new products or finding new products to add to your product line?
Pretty quickly, when I learned that the small amount of SKUs that we were selling, we were just never going to, I'm going to use today's word, we're never going to scale this. Right. We would never, I figured out, even if I sold X amount, we were always going to be this small little company. So I figured bedding would be natural, and we never did anything in bedding. So I went to Belgium, went to the mill, found third generation owner, and he enlightened me to this thing called a twisted warp, and it has 330 thread counts. Now, nobody had ever heard of thread count. So I put it out there, and I gave the tech behind it, and that started the thread count wars, probably back in 1980. So the Sfera thread count, it's consistent because we know the yarns we use, but you can never compare thread count because somebody could use the yarn, the size of a piece of wire, and somebody else a hair, and it's finer. So we birthed it and then we killed it. We had a site maybe 10 years ago that was called Lose Count, and we told everybody get away from the thread count. It's like we're sorry we ever started this thing.
Really?
Yeah.
So how hands-on were you in this new product development?
Oh, I was 100% hands-on, and I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about the product, but I had an eye, and I was extremely curious. I would go to a show, and I would look at everything, and I would ask if it's being distributed in the U.S. This is back when there wasn't as much importing as there is now, and certainly no direct importing. So I was always involved in 100% of everything.
Yeah, that's what I suspected. Paul, we're going to take a quick, brief pause here for a message from one of our sponsors.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. Modus is a proud sponsor for the Next Entrepreneur podcast, and we welcome them to the show. Modus is a national facility services company performing work for Fortune 500 companies all over the United States. So who is Modus and what do they do? These guys do the non-mechanical installations inside big distribution and fulfillment centers. So the way they like to say it is they take it from the conveyor to the dock door. What does that mean? It means they're building the pick stations. They're doing all the cabling for all of the electronic equipment. They're putting in bollards and barricades and signage and tape on the floor. And these are in huge facilities. They work in really tight time frames. They've never missed a schedule. So if you need help with your facility services in your distribution facilities, reach out to Modus. Modus can be found at modusmoves.com. Okay, we are back with Paul Hooker, the former CEO and chairman of the board of Sfera, a luxury linen company. Paul, I wanted to ask you if you can recall any entrepreneurial thoughts or experiences from a young childhood.
Well, I think as many of us did in the day, I had the paper routes, I mowed lawns, I was always working. I was always doing something to have some change in my pocket. But the one that I remember most was, so when I was about 5 years old, my mother was a very, very giving person, and I think I get an awful lot from that. And we lived near the railroad tracks, and literally the hobos of the day would come off the trains, and they'd be hungry, and they would notch on the gate who gave them food and who didn't. So as they approached, if they saw notches on the gate, they knew to knock, and they would be welcome. So they would come on our back porch. I can see it like it was yesterday. They would knock on the door, and I was so scared. I would hug my mother's leg, and she would tell me, just relax, here's what we're going to do. And this was Orville, Ohio, Smucker's Jelly. We had all the empty Smucker's jars. You'd fill it with coffee, put a piece of wax paper, close it up. She'd make the white bread sandwich, piece of bologna, mustard, close it up, wrap it nicely with the right corners with the wax paper. And then she made me come with her to the back door. I was so scared. These were scary people to me. Of course, they're not, but they were. I was 5. And I remember that process day after day after day. And what it turned out to be, it struck a chord in me of sharing your God-given gifts, sharing what you have that somebody else doesn't have. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that was an entrepreneurial spark or not, but my whole life pattern has followed that. I'm a big social entrepreneur. Yes, I'm an entrepreneur. And it goes back to my mother and that giving and showing me how to do it. And I never forgot it.
That's an amazing story. So I want to get back to Sfera and talk about a point where you began to see the light at the end of the tunnel, where you began to see the fruits of your labor pay off and revenues increase, and the thought of having a true profit began to come into the picture.
Well, I think that follows. As you ask me that question, I think of the different items that I created over the years with our manufacturers and suppliers. And the one that comes to mind is I was on the island of Madeira. Madeira is near the Canary Islands. It's a Portuguese possession. And Madeira does fine hand embroidery. They weren't doing as much in Italy, so we moved it to Madeira. And I was at a factory, not a factory, I was at a sewing room. And there was a room I walked by, and it was full of needlepoint. It was full of wool yarns and skeins. And I remember they had a skylight, and the brilliance of the light, the color coming out of that room, I had to stop. I went in, I said, "What is this?" She says, "Oh, we make needlepoint pillows for Europe. They're very fashionable throw pillows. They're all hand needlepoint." So I said, "Okay." I knew nothing about that. So as we're walking out, I noticed underneath the chair there was something rolled up. And I said to the woman, "What is that?" She said, "We tried to do Christmas stockings out of needlepoint. We sent it to our customers in Germany. They laughed at us." I said, "Do you mind if I take it back?" So I brought the needlepoint Christmas stocking back, and I had it on my desk for months and months. And I read in the paper that this gentleman named Roger Horchow, who used to work for Neiman Marcus, decided to come out with something that was extraordinary at the time. It was actually a magazine to send to your home that had home linens in it. Can you imagine? That wasn't done at that time, Sears and Roebuck and all of that. So Roger Horchow was looking for ideas, new ideas. So I took the needlepoint Christmas stocking, which is shown here.
That's an example of...
That's an example. So these we made back in the day for all of our children and my wife. So this is an example of it. And this is what literally was rolled up underneath. So I took the stocking, I rolled it up, I put it in an envelope, and I found the name of the buyer. It was Margaret Ann Cullum. I sent it down to her, and I forgot about it. Put a note. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Margaret Ann calls me. She says, "Mr. Horchow loves this." So we talked about it. He said, but he wants a name on it. So what I did was we took, actually, it was these 4 were our first designs. And what we did was we had the women in Madeira needlepoint this all the way up to the top. It's all done by hand to the top, and they would leave the top open. Now, this is back in the day before computers and fax machines or anything.
So that's all hand designed and hand stitched.
All hand stitched in wool. And people that know needlepoint know this takes a long time to do.
And so for our listeners who aren't watching the video, what you're holding there are Christmas stockings with a hand stitch or hand knitted,
hand needlepoint, hand petty point, in the shape of a Christmas stocking, showing various Christmas trees and angels and different scenes.
And it's something that did not exist in the United States.
Did not exist. Didn't exist anywhere in the world, actually. So I didn't know. I didn't know if it was an idea or not. And obviously I wasn't crazy about it because it sat on my desk for months until this opportunity came along. The other thing about being an entrepreneur is you've got to watch for the opportunities and take a shot. So what we did was, because of the length of time, we had them in Madeira make maybe 50 of each and leave the top open. And then I would have to sit there at the telex machine with the long yellow ribbon. I'm dating myself. And I'd be there all hours of the night banging these names down to Madeira. And the women the next morning would sit there and put the names on and then ship them. And the first year, I couldn't believe it. I had my first success, an item that nobody else had. Of course, I should have patented it, trademarked it. I'd never thought of that, all the things I should have done. Because the next year, I went back to Margaret Ann. I gave her a call, and I said, "Margaret Ann, it's Christmas season. I'm ready to go for your Christmas stockings again." And she said, "Paul, I'm really sorry, but you've been knocked off." She said, "That stocking you were selling to us for $30 and we were selling for $60. We can buy for $15. Somebody went to China and copied you." And I went on and on. I was maybe 28 years old. I said, "How can you do this?" "I did that." She said, "Paul, I know you did. It's business. This is life." "Okay." She said, I will do one thing for you. She said, "I know how hard you worked on this, and this was your idea. I know people in China who do needlepoint. She said, I can give you that name if you want. That's all I can do. Thank you. Hung up. The following week, I was on my way to China. And I'd never been to China. And this is back in the day when traveling to China was dicey. So I went to China, took the stocking, made all of our designs, got them all ready, had them, just not knowing what to do, but I was ready now. Margaret Ann calls me and said, Paul, the supplier that knocked you off just ruined it. Got the names wrong, didn't deliver anything. And I said, Margaret Ann, we are ready to roll. Now, I could have gone two ways in that, sat back and cried and did nothing, or do something about it. And I learned such a valuable lesson then that I never, ever, ever made anything again that could be knocked off, quality-wise. In fact, when I would introduce a product, I would send it to the people I know in China and ask them to knock it off. And if they couldn't, because of the weave, the fineness of the yarns, whatever it was, then I knew it was okay for me to go ahead with it. That never happened again. So P.S., this Christmas stocking business with Neiman Marcus, it became, and Horchow, it became their go-to every year. And in the day, we were doing 15,000, 20,000 stockings, but we would put the names on in New Jersey on a sewing machine, and we drop shipped them. So there's people all over the country to this day, because they're still running them, just Neiman Marcus and Horchow, that are adding to their collection. We would get orders, I remember from the Reagans, it was their kitchen cabinet and had Frank Sinatra and Ron, I knew by the first names because I knew who the order was from. We had all these really wonderful, iconic names that you would know. So everybody in America had these. And then when they copied me from China, I rolled it out from China, and I could be at the same price as anybody else then. So valuable, valuable lessons.
That's amazing. So would you say that was a product that got you into a profit zone, or
Yes.
were you profitable before then, or meaningfully profitable before then?
No,
Yeah.
we were break even profitable, and it wasn't because of the revenue side; it was because of the expense side. We had my wife work with me. We had a part-time bookkeeper. I answered the phones in the morning. I packed the packages in the afternoon.
Right.
So this was not a revenue producer. This was keeping the eye on the expense side. But when I had that item and I killed that item, and we made a lot of money on that, both earnings and revenue side, it gave me confidence. It taught me about being copied by somebody else and how to go forward. Then we got into the bedding business, and I learned that story then. I would never make anything again that could be copied in third world, because people watch Sfera to do that stuff. And I was naive up to that point.
Now, as you developed your bedding lines, is that when your business employee count started to grow?
Yes. I mean, we eventually, after 4 moves, when I sold the business, the end of the business in the fall of 2018, we had about 50 employees then in a much bigger industrial-sized office and warehouse. Yes, absolutely the bedding, because of all the product, the sheets, the comforters, the towels, everything that's involved in bedding and the bedroom in that area really, really exploded, because there were American mills that were doing certain qualities of sheets that was made in America. We were doing them in Italy, and it was a much better quality.
So, what would you say roughly was your revenue multiplier from when you started in '77 to when you sold?
Well, when we started in '77, it was $250,000 a year, and when I exited the business, we were north of $40 million.
Wow!
So
that's fantastic.
It was a long, 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 hard drive.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, during all this time, you're married, you're raising your family. There's an interesting story I saw about you coaching a basketball team. And
Little league team, was it that?
Was it a little? It was a
for the start of.
Yeah, you started with a team that had a winless season.
Oh, yes, that's a good one. You're right.
Yeah, and the thing that caught my mind about that story is how you went to become state champs which you credited as a result of an entrepreneurial attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just really interested on what that entrepreneurial attitude looked like in a sports team.
So I'd always wanted to be a high school baseball coach. I'd coached before, but I couldn't get into the public schools because of teacher contracts and things. So there was a Catholic high school. I went in for the interview. I somehow got hired, and I was there from 1990 to 1997. And the school was terrible at baseball. It had a terrible history. They were good at sports and all the other sports, but not baseball. They didn't care about it. So when I came in, I found a hitting coach, and I was doing everything I thought was right.
So this was baseball.
This was baseball.
I thought
yeah.
I had read basketball.
Yeah, this is 1990, and I told the AD he wasn't going to give me the job, and I said, Joe, he's still there, Joe Montano. I said, give me 5 years, Joe, and he kind of threw up his hands and laughed and said, okay, like on a 5-year. So year 1 and year 2 were not going well, and I knew it. I didn't think it was the coaching because I knew baseball and 20 years of going to clinics. I was passing down things that people smarter than me knew. It's my tenet in life. And one day I woke up and I thought, these kids are afraid to fail. This is about failure. So I got them in a corner one day. This is year 2, and I'm on a 5-year track here. And I said, guys, let me tell you a story about a guy named Wade Boggs. Now, Wade Boggs played in the major leagues, played for the Yankees and Red Sox. And Wade Boggs had a lifetime batting average of .326, and he was in the bigs for 23 years. And I'm telling this, and I'm saying Wade Boggs is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I said, so let's make the math easy. .326, let's say he batted .333. There has never been a player that played over 20 years that had a .333 lifetime average that isn't in the Hall of Fame. So what does .333 mean? It means you fail 2 out of 3 times. So I looked at every one of these little 16 and 17-year-olds, and I said, do this. For the next 16 years, if you can fail 2 out of 3 times, you're an automatic lock for the Hall of Fame. And then I told my pitchers, and you're not facing Wade Boggs. Throw the ball over the plate. So it was a complete upside down. Year 3, we won more games than we lost. And year 4, out of my 5-year, we were New Jersey parochial state champions.
That's amazing.
And it was all that mental getting over of losing, the fear of losing. Failure. We embrace, at my company, we embrace failure because we know we're going to fail, but we don't want to fail at the same thing twice. So when we fail, we come in and talk about it, and then we don't fail at that again. We fail at something else. So embracing failure is so important in life.
That's a great story. Paul, what do you think of your personality traits that you possess do you feel most supports your entrepreneurial successes?
Oh, I'm very, very hands-on. I through my business career, it's been the hardest thing for me was to delegate. But I knew as I was scaling, I couldn't continue to be like this. So to be involved in every area of everything that was going on, that's something I had always done, and I had to get away from. It was a very hands-on, very involved. And I loved to make the decisions. There was the problem. We make a decision. We fail on some. We succeed on some. We move along. So I was very decisive on things like that, and I failed many, many, many times.
So is it safe to say that you always felt that 100% of the responsibility was on you, on your back, as far as whether the company succeeded or not, and whether, no matter how long you had to work to get a product to market or...
Mm-hmm. There's no question. I would never, ever put, not that I put blame on anybody anyway, but it was always me. Because if they didn't do something that was correct and it failed, I would blame myself for not mentoring them correctly or not teaching them correctly. You know?
Right. So I was wondering if you could tell us that experience of your exit strategy and controlling interest of your business that you'd been at for 35 years.
Sure.
Right. What was that like for you emotionally? And can you kind of walk us through that process?
So the philosophy of life is this. If you put a dime on the top of the Empire State Building the thickness of that dime in comparison to the height of the Empire State Building is as long as man has been on Earth versus how long Earth has been here. We're a fly speck. We're going to come and go. So at 25, my wife and I were fortunate enough that in 3 or 4 years we had our children and we were young. And I could see where our children, if God willing, we're going to be healthy and out and working, we could be relatively young and enjoying life. Because I was not going to work for money the rest of my life. My personal goal was always selfish. It was to get into heaven. And I basically wanted to stand before my God, and the quote would be, and I've got it right in my head, God would say to me, besides making money, what did you do with all those talents I gave you? And I want to be able to go to my back pocket and pull out a list that unfolds all the way to the floor. It's all in my mind. And that's all. So I knew I couldn't do a whole lot of that while I was working my 13-hour days and helping Margaret raise the children. So I said, 25 bought it. By 55, and I was thinking this when I was 30, find somebody a good president to run the company, give them 5 years, and at 60, sell the company. And that's what I did. And to follow up on how I did that, so I had the president in line, great guy, everything was good, the numbers were good, the growth was good. I had no idea how to sell this company. What do you do? So we're in New Jersey. We're 50 miles from New York. I went to New York City. I found an investment banker. I went in, the president of the company. Luckily, I found somebody good, and they speak a language I do not speak, the mergers and acquisitions and all of that. So that was a one-year rodeo. They had private equity come in from all over the country. They spoke the language I didn't, but I had to give them the thought that going forward in the future, what the future was. So I was fortunate. A couple of years later, private equity came in. They bought 80% of it. So I was still chairman of the board, keeping 20%, which they liked. The owner to have skin in the game.
Right.
And then last October, another private equity firm bought them and bought my 20%. I was out. So this is not about, I knew nothing about the Wall Street ways of life. You just find it like you find a product. You get out there and start looking.
Yeah, so I would venture to say that most entrepreneurs, when they're thinking of their exit strategy, aren't thinking about driving into the city and knocking on the door of an investment banker and say, hey, let's do this.
If you need an attorney, you find an attorney. Yeah. You bring the skill set to the table that's needed for the job A and B that you don't have. So as I thought back and talked to some people, they said, Paul, you don't need a lawyer right now. You don't need an accountant right now. You need a good investment banker. Then he recommends the lawyer in New York. Here's 2 or 3. Again, networking through people smarter than you. It's pervasive through my entire life.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's, stories like that help our listeners to get a vision of, okay, number one, how do you start it? But how do you end it?
How do you end it?
And that's an amazing story.
Yeah, if you don't end it correctly, you've wasted your whole entrepreneurial journey. You're right. It's not about starting it. It's the A to Z, and the Z is as important as the A. So we've exited. I'm 66 now. We're doing so many different social programs, social entrepreneurship programs, and we're very, very blessed that it's followed the path that we'd hoped.
So I saw where you were recognized as one of the top 100 graduates of Bowling Green State University in the first 100 years of the university, and I was curious what that means to you.
That meant a lot. Only again because I was first generation. And to think of a public university in Ohio of 20,000 students, and when I heard the stories of the others, I paled in comparison to what I thought they did. But what was interesting? I think a big part of that, me getting in there, was the social entrepreneur part of it, because the story of having the program with kids with special needs. And I think that actually weighed more than the widgets and entrepreneurial money-making products that I had, which most of the other people had. I couldn't have competed with what these people were in the world of broadcasting and everything else. But I brought that to the table, and Bowling Green recognized that. I was very, very proud of that.
Yeah, and this social entrepreneurial endeavor that you did should have been considered equally with your career, because they're both spectacular. So let's talk about that social project.
Sure.
This is something that you started 29 years ago?
Yeah, so what happened was in 1990, I was president of the local Little League, Lencroft Little League, and my children were all knee-high, and they were starting to play Little League. So a couple years later, 1990, I became president of the league. 1,500 families. It was a big, big league. I was coming downstairs from a board meeting, and I saw this little girl sitting in a wheelchair. And I knew her, Nicole Bongelati. She was from town. I knew her parents. And she was sitting in her wheelchair. She had spina bifida, so she couldn't get out of the wheelchair. And she's watching her two brothers play Little League. So I went up to her and I said, Nicole, how you doing? And she looked up at me. She's my son's age, so she'd be 40 right now. She said, Mr. Hooker, this stinks. I said, what do you mean this stinks? It's a beautiful day. She said, how come my brothers can play Little League and I can't? Well, it was 1990. I was going to say, because you're in a wheelchair. But I didn't say that. I went back to the board. I said, why don't we do something for Nicole and her friends? Nicole and I are still in touch on Facebook to this day. And, okay, parents got this and that. I got my kids to help. And we did a nice little Little League program. And the parents came up to me after that, and they said, Paul, this was amazing. This is before anybody was doing anything for special needs people involving athletics. I mean, certainly there were big organizations, but not the recreation organization. And they said, what's next? And I said, what do you mean, what's next? There is no next. I've got a business. I've got little kids. I got a lot going on in my life. 29 years later, we've got 10 sports year-round. We built 2 $500,000 playgrounds that are accessible. They would come to me and say, I would ask them for ideas. And they'd say, my child always wanted to play soccer. We did soccer. We did basketball. We did golf. We did jazzercise. We've got so many programs right now that are going year-round, and it's all volunteer-based. And this is our 29th year.
And so we're talking about kids with spina bifida, cerebral palsy.
Here's what's interesting, Andrew. I know nothing. We're fortunate to have 3 able-bodied children. I never knew anything about that. So what I would say to the parents is, bring them. It's age 7 and up. Yes, but my child. I said, I don't know what they have. I don't care what they have. Right. We've got teenagers. That's who they want to connect with. So we never got into that. I know there's some big organizations, for example, that don't accept blind children. See, we didn't have anything. We brought them. Kids with all kind of quadriplegics and wheelchairs and couldn't move anything but maybe a tray. We put a couple teenagers there, and they'd be laughing with them because they were there for confirmation and bat mitzvah and those type. They were doing community service. And it didn't matter what the disability was. So we went for 29 years, and they would always say, Paul, my child has, and I said, is your child 7? They said, yes, but we're good. Let's go. Bring them. Yeah.
Paul, that's beautiful. And I can see that connection back to the story of your mother when you were 5 years old.
That's where it emanates.
Yeah, absolutely.
It certainly does.
Paul, we're going to take a quick, brief pause here for a message from one of our sponsors. MBD Automation is a proud sponsor for the Next Entrepreneur podcast, and we welcome them to the show. MBD Automation is a mechanical install contractor who installs conveyor systems and automated equipment, VRCs and singulators and sorters and all sorts of equipment that you'll find in e-commerce fulfillment centers, distribution centers, mail processing facilities, airports, and the industrial market, and in the defense industry. MBD Automation works all over the United States and has a list of international clients that they perform work for in the U.S. as well. When you're looking for your next mechanical install contractor, reach out to MBD Automation. They can be found on the internet at mbdautomation.com. You know, the thing that I'm seeing out of your program is not just what you're doing for those families and providing opportunities for them to be on a team, maybe to have their own number, right? And
Trophies.
Yeah.
29 years, every single sport we do, the last session, every child gets a trophy. Now, I know that's with the helicopter parents today, and everybody comes in first.
No, we get it.
That's different from able-bodied.
Absolutely.
These kids relish it.
Absolutely, and it's huge. But I think what you've created may be equally as important as an opportunity for teenagers, young people, college students to volunteer and to interact with children, to be their buddies, to be their helpers, and create a sense of sharing and caring and giving and helping. And I think it's just tremendous.
Well, along those lines, this is what was amazing, and this was what God's plan was. So 1990 was the American Disabilities Act, ADA, and what that meant to a lot of these students were they were now going to be taken out of the special schools they were in and assimilated into the public schools. So these kids were terrified to go to high school and have people make fun of them. Kids can be cruel. So I had stories of parents calling me saying, Paul, you won't believe what happened today. I took Jimmy to school, and he was so afraid, and he was walking down the hall, and 3 of his buddies from soccer walked over to him and said, hey, Jimmy, what's up, man? And gave him 5, introduced him to friends. Huge deal there. Another one, I'm at Costco a few years ago, and a mother came up to me and she says, I got to tell you something, Paul. My daughter was 12 when she started volunteering. She today just graduated with a degree in special education from the love she got when she was 12. So my point is, this has just come so full circle, and now we're going to colleges, and we're finding out that 80% of the volunteers are from the College of Education. These kids, young adults, they're going out into the world working with special needs. So they're actually coming to these events knowing more than we do. And it's like an unpaid internship for them. Who would have thought this?
It's amazing. Paul, I cannot tell you how impressed I am with that project and everything that I've seen from it. And I look forward to talking with your executive director, Luke Sims, soon to talk about his entrepreneurial endeavor. But last question here, and it's about this social entrepreneur aspect of your life, which has been a huge part. But and I think anyone that knows you knows the answer to this. But what has the impact of your involvement, your creation, development, nurturing of that project meant to you in your life?
Oh, it's meant everything. I couldn't have gone through life being as blessed and as fortunate as I am, Margot and I. We're celebrating our 45th anniversary this year. We've got 3 wonderful, healthy children. We're coming up on 10 grandchildren this year. We are so blessed in so many ways that had I gone through my life and not done something big and bold to put on that scale to balance it out, I'd have been miserable. The scale would have been too heavily tipped. And I really feel that brought me back into balance. So now the social entrepreneurship, that's so cool because it's the 2 things that I believe in. I'm an entrepreneur, but now I can focus it more on doing well by doing good and helping different. Like, for example, we want to develop a product for Rallycap, and we want it to have a revenue stream. So we're going to figure out how that's done. So it's another entrepreneurial venture for us.
Well, Paul Hooker, you are big and bold, and it is the greatest honor to be your friend and to have worked with you on a few projects. And I guess we should touch base on what we did earlier today. So,
there's no question.
Yeah. So why don't you walk us through that?
So the local community, we we had little kids from elementary schools telling us that they had friends with special needs that couldn't ride a bike. And it just broke my heart, because that's the right of every child, is to ride a bike. So we went to a school. I had a sister-in-law that passed away who was involved with us forever. And my brother-in-law said, we'd like to do something so that her memory will live forever. And we married the two of creating bicycles for special needs people. But without Andrew McClendon, I couldn't have done that. That was a skill set I didn't have. So I was selfishly reaching out to Andrew that night after I saw the news to get him to New York, because I needed him to fulfill my part of that dream. So today the event was, these bikes cost about $2,000 each. They're custom made depending on the disability of the child or young adult. And today we gave away 5 of them. It's not describable watching these children and young adults ride a bike for the first time, and really, for the most part, not even riding it. They're being pushed by their helper, but their feet are moving on the pedals, and you looked at their faces, and dear God, you can't pay enough money for that.
Yeah, it's just absolutely spectacular. So this is our 3rd time working together. You have funded about 15 bikes at this point, doing 5 each delivery day. And I can tell you that I look forward to this day probably more than any day of the year.
Wow.
It is, today, this morning, that event was absolutely spectacular.
Well, for you to come up from Louisiana every year and to be such an integral part of this, we couldn't have done this. This wouldn't have happened without your help and inspiration. So thank you. It's a good collaboration.
Oh, man. We love it, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. So, Paul, thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking with you today, and the pearls of wisdom that you shared on your entrepreneurial journey.
Thank you.
We're very grateful. Thank you,
you,
sir.
Andrew.
Nice for Paul Hooker to invite us into his home to do the podcast. Such a great man, and what a wonderful storyteller he is. I love listening to his stories, but from when he walked into his business and so many years ago, and some of the stories he told about that, but loved how he developed all these new product lines over his career, just constantly improving and bringing new products to the market. Going over to China back when that was rarely done by American businessmen, and to go and figure that whole scene out. He learned a lot of lessons. He learned a lot about trademarking, and there's a lot to take away from that. But also, of course, his exit strategy. So how many people can grow a business and then be taken out by a private equity firm? So, and he tells us, the story of how he did that. So a lot to be learned from Paul Hooker, and of course, his stories of his foundation, which is approaching 30 years old, I believe, and he's just done amazing things for the special needs community, and he continues to do more and more as it grows. Very passionate about his charitable project, Rallycap Sports. So, and I think that's probably the best way to reach Paul Hooker is through rallycapsports.org. The Next Entrepreneur can be found on iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on our YouTube channel and on Facebook. You can reach Propel Productions at propelyourstory.com. Our producer today is Daniel Sagona.